Hi, I'm Bill Bradley. Join me for a recent excerpt of American Voices. This is Bill Bradley. Each week on Sirius XM Radio, you can hear my show American Voices about people doing wonderful things in this country. But this week, we have a special presentation for you. Remembering a Japanese consul in World War II who saved thousands of Jews in Lithuania.
Those are children that could have never have existed. But then there are people like Sugihara who did everything he could to save them.
What he had was an unbending devotion to doing what was right.
We are listed as number 15, 16, and 17 of visas that Sugihara issued. If not for that, we would have been doomed.
I'm Bill Bradley. You're listening to American Voices special presentation that's coming up right now.
American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley is made possible by Barrick Gold, America's largest gold producer and a force for good in the communities where we live and work.
Today, it's estimated that at least 40,000 people are alive because of this hero named Sugihara.
My name is Nathan Lewin. I was saved by Sugihara.
My name is Barry Shane. My father,
my grandfather,
my grandparents,
my great-grandparents
was saved
by
Sugihara.
Was saved by Sugihara.
We're alive thanks to this incredible man.
He saved us, but if he didn't save us, we wouldn't be alive right now.
During World War II, Jews living in Kaunas, also known as Kovna, Lithuania, were desperate to leave the country because of the approaching Nazi takeover. If they didn't leave, they knew they would be sent to concentration camps. The Japanese consul in Kovna, Chiune Sugihara, wrote thousands of visas to save these Jews, which allowed them to leave the country and travel to Japan. The cable from the foreign ministry told Sugihara to stop writing these visas. No exception, no further inquiries, it said. But Sugihara refused. He wrote visas day and night, and thanks to him, today there are about 40,000 people that are alive today, the descendants of the people that he saved. David Wolpe, rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, recently traveled to Japan to speak with children about this hero named Sugihara. And Rabbi Wolpe is with me now. Thanks for coming on American Voices.
I'm delighted to be able to speak with you and to tell such an uplifting story.
So, for people who might not know or might not have heard of Sugihara-san, explain to us what he did and what these visas meant to people and how the visas saved them.
Well, he was the ambassador in 1940, and by then, Polish Jews were flooding into Lithuania. Lithuanian Jews were terrified of what was coming next and wanted to leave. And Sugihara himself had a very little bit of experience with Jews because he had once been invited because of a chance encounter to the house of a Jewish family for Hanukkah, which is a festival that happens in the winter. So he knew who Jews were, but he had no deep attachment to Judaism or the Jewish people. What he had was an unbending and really almost singular devotion to doing what was right. He had shown this, by the way, previously in his life as well, but this was on an entirely different level. And what happened was that the Jews would crowd around the embassies and ask for passage. And of course, in the vast majority of cases, the embassies and the ambassadors would close their doors. Sugihara had a meeting with his wife and with his children, and both he and his wife said, we have to do this, and she deserves credit as well. Yukiko was her name. She was his partner in this, and so he just began to write visas for Jews to go through Japan to a variety of locations.
And the foreign ministry kept telling him to stop, right?
And the foreign ministry didn't want him to do it. And also, of course, the foreign ministry had a concern because they were allied with Germany. And this was clearly against the desires of the Germans. They didn't want Jews fleeing from Germany. So Sugihara, though, not only kept writing them in defiance of the ministry, but even when they closed the foreign embassy down, he took with him the stationery that was the official stationery of the government and kept writing them individually on his own. And even though it had no real authority, people didn't know that when you present it at the border and it's on Japanese stationery and it has the name of the vice consul. So people accepted the visas. And even, although I couldn't track down the name, unfortunately, but several people said he left the stamp of the foreign ministry with one of the refugees and told him to try to forge visas on his own.
Mm.
To the point where when the train literally was pulling out of the station and he had to go back because they had closed the embassy and that was it, Japan had no further presence in Lithuania, there were numerous eyewitness testimonies of his throwing visas out the train window as he wrote them to the waiting crowds below. And every one of those visas could save a family, not just an individual. This is an extraordinarily heroic man.
My name is Nathan Lewin. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C., practicing law with my daughter and also teaching as an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School on Supreme Court practice. I was saved by a Sugihara visa that was issued when I was 4 years old, that was used by my parents. My mother knew that if he invaded Poland, it would be disastrous. By then we were gone, in fact, smuggled across the border through a forest in the middle of the night into Lithuania. Since I was 3, there was some concern that I might be frightened and cry out. So I was warned that if I made any sound, I would be eaten by wolves in the forest. I kept silent through the night, and we made our way to Vilna by reason of these Sugihara visas. I'm holding in my hand a copy of the travel document. It has a picture of me sitting on my mother's lap, and that document has the handwritten Sugihara visa. We are listed as numbers 15, 16, and 17 of visas that Sugihara issued, and I had to manage to have the privilege of having a conversation with a son of Sugihara, Hiroki Sugihara. When I was 4 years old and got the visa, he was 5 years old, and he recalled family conversations in which his father, Mr. Sugihara, made it clear that notwithstanding the contrary instruction from the Foreign Office, he was going to issue the visas because it was necessary to save these people's lives, and he did so. If not for that, we would have been trapped and doomed, as so many other Jews were. You know that you're around because this person did the right thing.
My name is Julie Shane. I'm a writer based in New York. My grandfather was saved by Sugihara. My grandfather escaped Poland through Lithuania, and from there he made his way to Shanghai, and he did that because he was able to receive a visa from Sugihara in August of 1940, what might have been one of the last opportunities to be able to get a visa. And there was a samurai saying that inspired Sugihara, roughly translating to, even the hunter does not kill the bird that comes to him for refuge. And that saying of just someone who is overtaken by compassion and overtaken by this need to help people. He was writing the visas with such urgency and so quickly, and so many of them, as many as he possibly could, that I think his hands cramped up, and his wife massaged his hands in order for him to be able to continue writing visas day after day after day. All the joys that I've had in my life, every single one of them, and there have been so many, and they're all thanks to Sugihara. I've always wanted to thank his family for what he did, and so I reached out to Rabbi Walpe, who connected me with Nobuki Sugihara. I wrote a letter to Sugihara's son. When I wrote the letter, I was crying. And in the letter, I write, Nobuki Sugihara, you don't know me, but I owe my life to your father, Chiune Sugihara. I discussed a little bit about my grandfather's story, and I said, there are not enough words I can grasp at in the human language to express the gratitude I feel to Sugihara and to you. There are tens of thousands of people like me, and there will be countless more. We have never forgotten about Sugihara. We never will. But I heard back from Nobuki Sugihara. He said something along the lines of that his father is smiling from heaven, and I feel deeply lucky to thank someone who I know is responsible for my life. It was this incredible opportunity to be able to tell this person, I know that I'm alive thanks to you. I know that I'm alive thanks to your father. I know the work that you've done, and my whole future is ahead of me because of you. It's amazing to know that there are so many people walking around in the world, and I'm one of them, who's alive because of someone's extraordinary capacity for kindness, for saving my grandfather, for my father's life, for my aunts and uncle, for my cousins, for my 4 nieces and nephews. My youngest is a few months old and was born back in May. And they're all just these like incredible people growing up, and they're so full of life. And those are children that could have never have existed. I mean, it's sad to think that someone wouldn't have wanted them to ever be born. But then there are people like Sugihara who saw the masses of people and thought every single one of them deserved to be saved, and did everything he could to save them. You know, humanity is capable of so much more than you see on a daily basis.
So, Rabbi Wolpe, why did Chiune Sugihara decide to do this?
So that is, of course, one of those unanswerable questions, but I'll give you at least having spoken with his son, with some people who had done research into his life, here's at least the bit that I've pieced together. From the time he was young, in a very conformist society, he was not a conformist. He loved literature and languages, and he was an outstanding student, the best in his class, and his father wanted him to be a doctor. Sugihara didn't want to be a doctor, but his father made him sit for the medical exams. So he sat for the medical exams and left every answer blank. Now, an ordinary kid, and certainly an ordinary Japanese kid in that time, doesn't do that. So he ended up in the Foreign Service so that he could travel and speak languages. In 1934, he resigned his position in Manchuria because he didn't like the way the Japanese were treating the Chinese. So this was someone who really was just gifted or burdened with a very powerful conscience. And when I spoke to his son, he said, look, he was a very simple person. He loved children, he loved to garden, but he always felt like he knew what was right and what was wrong, and he had no questions about it.
So where did the Jews go when they got their visas? They had to go to Japan, and then where did they go from Japan?
Some went to Korea, some went to China, some found their way, strangely enough, to England and the Western world. I think once they got to Japan, there was a vast scattering of possibilities, but a lot of them stayed somewhere in the East until the end of the war. There were communities in Shanghai, some of whom came through there, and a few stayed in Japan, but most moved through because Japan wasn't at the time a place where Jews would feel too safe, since they were allied with Germany as well.
So the thing is, what he did was not initially recognized. In fact, what happened to him when he went back to Japan?
So, as you might imagine, a government that tells an official not to do something and then discovers he did it is not that hospitable to him. And he was eventually relieved of his position. Most people I spoke to said he was relieved of his position because of what he did. He himself never spoke of it, not only out of modesty, but because he expected that people would not approve of what he had done. It was not something to brag about. But I do know that this guy who was so gifted was reduced to selling light bulbs and other jobs that were certainly not commensurate with either his ability or with his character. I think the philosophy, it seemed, was just to keep it quiet.
Right. Yeah.
He didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about it. It was a shameful thing. And after the war, of course, the Japanese were very focused on rebuilding and did not, in general, go through the same sort of self-reckoning
that,
for example, the Germans did.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, You know, he saved a lot of Jews and they fled and found safety. And then they were looking for him and they
Yes.
had difficulty finding him.
So what happened was, first of all, the Mir Yeshiva, which was one of the most famous academies of learning in Eastern Europe, all the leadership of the Mir Yeshiva were saved by Sugihara. And they eventually made their way to Israel. So first of all, he almost kept an institution intact. And then some very famous individuals were saved by him. The Chicago business magnate, Sam Zell, his parents.
Really?
Yep. And so there was a young man in the Israeli embassy in Tokyo, and he had been saved as a teenager coming from Poland by Sugihara. And so he sought him out, and he finally found him, I believe in 1968. And this is obviously many years after the war, and convinced him to come to Israel. He was honored at Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Institution in Israel, and he was elevated into being a hero. In fact, his son, and this is typical, they asked Sugihara, what can we do for you? Because the state of Israel feels like it owes you a great debt. He said, you can help my son get an education. And so they brought his son to Israel and gave him a full, free education at Israeli universities, and he stayed there for 18 years. He lived there.
Amazing.
Now he lives in Belgium, and he told me that it was a wonderful experience for him, and that's where he learned that his father was a hero. He didn't learn it in Japan. He learned it in Israel.
Right.
All he wanted at the end of his life was to play with his grandchildren and tend his garden. He had no desire. He was sort of forced every now and then to be honored, but that was not at all his personality. His personality was entirely retiring and humble.
Well, so when people raised this with Sugihara, what did he say about the decision that he made? Did he see himself
No.
as a hero?
Like so many rescuers, and I'm sure that you've come across this in your reading and speaking, so many rescuers in so many different places, not only from the Holocaust, but from other catastrophes in the world, from Rwanda, other places. When you ask them, how could you have done this? They say, what else could you do? His son said to me, my father always thought it was obvious and anybody would have done it.
My name is Philip Rosen. I'm a lawyer with the firm of Weil Gotshal in New York. I have 4 kids and a son-in-law, and I have a granddaughter who's 9 months old. My father and my uncle were 2 of the people saved by Sugihara. My father left Warsaw, Poland, and his father, who was a very smart man, told 3 of his children, who were 20, 21, and 22, and didn't have families. He told them to leave and just run as fast and as far as they can. When they were in the forest outside of Warsaw, they heard this, now not crazy, but at that time crazy story about a Japanese consul general in Lithuania who was considering issuing visas to the Jews to allow them to survive. And he said to his brothers, we have to go there. And they made it. And they stood for hours and hours, maybe days, outside of the consulate, along with thousands of other Jews. My father said that it was the only hope that they could even think exists for survival. You know, this was not a matter of what type of life they're going to lead. It was just a matter of, are they going to be killed or not killed? And they had heard by that point all of the stories about what the Germans were planning on doing. My father said that he felt very alone. You know, this was the first time that he and his brother were not with their family, and they felt very alone. He looked around and he saw little children and he saw older people. He saw a lot of pregnant women. It was just a matter of, let's see what happens, and please God, this man should perform a miracle. So my father remembers when he got it, when his term online came, he said that he cried. He cried not even knowing whether the visa would work, and the odds were against it, but it was the 1 in a million shot, and he was willing to take the 1 in a million shot because the other side of the coin was 1,000,000% not surviving. He felt that he owed it to his family And obviously he didn't know that they were going to be killed in concentration camps, but he knew that their lives would be much more difficult than his. I pray every day, and in my prayers, I say thank you to God for sending Sugihara to my family and allowing us to survive. You know, my father always used to say that he could spend all of his time wondering why he was the lucky one. He would always say to us, you have to do something special. You have to be successful in life. You have to bring up kids in the right way. You have to bring up grandchildren the right way, only because we are the lucky ones. And as lucky ones, we have to take advantage of that opportunity. And so, you know, my father was probably more proud of everything we accomplished, everything we did, than any of our friends' parents. And part of that was, you know, the rest of the family was gone. So every time I join an organization or a cause, I do it with that in mind, that I am the lucky one and I've got to live the life of someone who was given a second chance. My father, you know, I used to ask him questions about when he found out that they didn't survive. How did he find that out? And he said that somebody came to Shanghai who was with them in the camps and saw them going to their death. My father was great. He never wanted to impose a burden on me, so he would never tell us the painful parts of life in Shanghai. Other people told me about how poor they were and how difficult it was to survive and how much they missed their families. But my father would never do that. My father always wanted his children to live a life free from the pain of survivor. But I wonder all the time whether Sugihara himself really thought that he was going to save all of these people, whether they were really going to make it. And I've had the unbelievable opportunity to become friends with Buki Sugihara, who's Sugihara's youngest son. And he said that he's not sure his father really believed that anybody would survive. But he said to his son that if one survivor makes it, I've done the right thing. And I try in all different ways to give thanks to him. There's a series of coins in Israel that are dedicated to different moments in Israeli history. And I asked them to produce a coin, and I gave them a picture of Sugihara, and they did. And a number of people have it. I'm looking at it right now, and it has his picture in the front with his name on top, Chiune Sugihara in both English and Japanese. And it says Japan, and then below it, it says his name in Hebrew. On the back of the coin, it has two cool Japanese symbols. It says his name is nicknamed Sempo Sugihara, and it says Kovno, Lithuania, 1940. I have an entire section of my library with books and pictures of Sugihara. I have his picture on the wall in my office and in my home, and I tell the story whenever I can. I feel like I'm the beneficiary of a miracle.
Well, I'll tell you. Rabbi, how do you understand heroism? I mean, is Sugihara-san a hero or an angel? How do you think about it?
I think that there are certain human beings who are the moral equivalent of the Olympic athlete. That is, they fulfill the human potential that is in everyone, but that most of us don't bother to cultivate or to grow. And sometimes we are incredibly blessed that God has seated some such righteous people among us. And sometimes you don't know those people until they're severely tested. And it could be your next door neighbor, and I would say to your listeners, it could be you. You don't know. It was astonishing to me when I wrote the editorial how many people, both in Japan and here and around the world, had never heard of him. I asked the flight attendant on my flight on the way over there, have you ever heard of him? No, she's never heard of him. And also how many people wrote me and said that they were saved by him.
Yet, as you say, at that moment, he stepped forward, and there is that potential in each of us, if our moment comes to step forward.
And just so.
Well, but Sugihara was putting his life and his family's life in danger in this moment of moral challenge. Do you ever wonder what you would do if you were in a similar situation?
All the time. I say, my father was a rabbi in Philadelphia, but he used to say, I always wondered, how would I act if I was an inmate in a concentration camp, and how would I act if I was a guard? In other words, what would you do if you had power over someone else, and what would you do in moments when your own life is at risk? How would you act? And I think about that question a lot, because for most of us, whether we have the emotional courage to defy the people around us, to be disliked, to be shunned, to be disapproved of, and that takes enormous inner strength. And I think that you're much more likely to be able to do that if you have a belief in something greater than yourself. If you really believe that God approves of what you do and you're doing it for a reason that He's noble and good and kind, and you're acting like an image of God in this world, it can help buffet the blows of people's disapproval.
So you met with some Japanese children who attended the same school that Sugihara attended. What did you say to them, and how did they respond to the story?
Well, the Israeli ambassador, she told them, these were 15-year-olds, she told them that when her mother was 15, she was taken to Majdanek, the concentration camp, saw her parents taken away and her brother shot before her eyes. And you could see that for the first time they understood what Sugihara had done, what he had saved people from, because now they knew what would happen to the people if he hadn't written those visas, and what happened to the people who didn't get those visas. I mean, that was very powerful to see them, almost the shock in their eyes when she told them what happened to people their own age. And then what I said to them was actually what you said earlier, which is at some point in your life, you're going to be faced with a moral choice. And it may be as simple as somebody who is in or outside of your social circle that you see is alone and is scared, or it may be something much bigger. It may be a grand issue of policy or politics or family. You don't know. But I hope that at that moment you'll remember you went to the same school as this great man who had the enormous courage to do what everyone around him told him not to do.
I may have to disobey the government, but if I don't, I would be disobeying God. Chiune Sugihara.
I am 5 years old. I'm 7 years old.
I'm 11 years old.
I'm 9 years old.
I am 15 years old.
And my great-grandfather.
My great-grandfather was saved.
He was saved.
By Sugihara.
He was saved by Sugihara. Was saved by Sugihara.
And I feel grateful.
He was so brave. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't be alive.
And that's the last of our American Voices for today, but you can continue our conversation on Facebook, facebook.com/American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley. Senior producer, Devorah Klahr. Assistant producer, Christine Whelan. Special thanks to Chris Gibbons, Eric Gonzalez, and David Rodriguez.
American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley is made possible by Barrick Gold, America's largest gold producer and a major supporter of education, the arts, and environmental conservation in the western U.S.
I'm your host, Bill Bradley. Thank you for listening to American Voices here on my YouTube channel. For more interviews celebrating the goodness and creativity of the American people, click the subscribe button below.